Rudy.
Cement makes what? Cement makes what? Cement makes what?
TV, concrete. First, you get some gravel. Pour it in the bowl. Mix a mess of mortar. You add some add water. See the mellow-rooney come out. Slurp, slurp, slurp.
Cement makes what? Cement makes what? Cement makes what?
Who wants a bucket of cement?
Komt u even mee stappen? Want er is nog deze schitterende wagen.
Isn't that cute? Man. So jealousy can be a very destructive force if not kept in check. Now, I know this video was amusing, but we've all seen the destructive, sometimes horrific results of what happens when certain people aren't able to control their anger or the emotions associated with their jealousy. Some of you might remember how shocking it was to hear about that murder-suicide that resulted in the death of Phil Hartman. If you don't know who Phil Hartman is, he rose to fame in the 90s as a regular cast member of Saturday Night Live. Well, his wife, Bryn, she took his life while he was asleep, and then several hours later, she turned the gun on herself. Well, a huge factor in this murder-suicide was jealousy. There's a biography about his life that was put out not too long ago that described the events that led up to his death. And in that book, Phil Hartman's ex-wife, she shared a story of a time when she had sent Phil and his wife Bryn a little card just to say congratulations on the birth of their new son. Well, what she got in return may have been a warning of things to come, but in this book, she describes how Bryn's response to this innocent gesture, this very friendly gesture, congratulating them on their newborn son, was a 4-page, hate-filled diatribe threatening her life and warning her to never, ever try to contact her husband again or she would rip her eyes out. That's a quote. And that wasn't the first or the last time that she would fly off the handle like that. According to those who were closest to Phil, as his fame grew, Bryn became more possessive and more jealous, even to the degree that sometimes Phil would get a slew of fan mail, and she would get angry and start having these, object-throwing temper tantrums. Anybody know a woman like that? You want to raise your hand if you're married to a woman? Anyway. But the reality is that a lot of folks in this room do know what it's like to be in a relationship with someone like that and understand how unhealthy and how destructive jealousy can be. But with all that said, there are some people who believe that jealousy actually could be helpful for a relationship. There's a book that you can read online for free. It's called Why We Love, and it was written by some biological anthropologist who claims that a little bit of jealousy in a healthy relationship, and underlined healthy, but a little bit of jealousy in a healthy relationship might actually be beneficial. Here's what she says. At first glance, jealousy appears to be a death knell to a love affair. But psychologists believe that it can actually encourage a mate to soothe the mistrustful partner with declarations of fidelity and attachment. And these reassurances can have a positive effect and contribute to the durability of the relationship. So it's interesting. This person seems to say that jealousy might be a good thing. And so what is the difference between healthy jealousy and destructive jealousy? I think it's a very important question to ask in light of the message that I'm going to be sharing with you today. If you have not been here over the last few weeks, I've been in a message series on the names of God. God has many names revealed to us in the scriptures. I talked about the first week that God, his name is Yahweh, which means I am. He's the self-existent one, always was, always will be. the great I am. And then the week after that, I spoke about God as he's Yahweh Shalom. He is our peace in times of adversity and in times of trouble. Well, today, I'm going to talk about another name that God himself reveals to us in the book of Exodus. And it's found in Exodus chapter 34, verse 14. But before we get to this particular name of God, I'm going to just set up the scene for you because I think it's important. So, and many of you have seen 10 Commandments, so you know the story. But essentially, God meets with Moses up on Mount Sinai, and he tells him that he wants the Israelites, these people, to be his treasured possession. He wants them to be a people that are set apart just for him. But in order for them to maintain this unique and this exclusive relationship with God, it would require them to be faithful to a covenant that he wanted to make with them. What is a covenant? A covenant is much like wedding vows made between a husband and wife. In fact, that is exactly how God views this covenant that he's going to make with his people, the Israelites. We see this in the book of Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah 2, verse 2, where God is looking back on his relationship with the Israelites during their time through the wilderness. But look at how he describes it. The Lord says, I remember the devotion of your youth, how as a bride you loved me and you followed me through the wilderness. Sometimes that's hard for the more macho fellows in here saying, wow, as a bride. But we're described by God as the bride of Christ. And that's because that's the kind of intimacy that God wants with his people. And so in this case here, God invites them to join into this covenant relationship with him, and they accept the invitation, and they make all these promises. We'll do whatever is necessary to ensure that we're faithful to this covenant with you, God. So Moses makes his way up Mount Sinai in order to get those terms of the agreement etched in stone, which we often refer to as the 10 Commandments, although there were a slew of other commandments throughout that time. And then we all know what happens next. You saw Charlton Heston come down off the mountain with those commandments, right? And you look down, and there they are dancing around the golden calf, and he is just outraged that they've already broken the first 2 commandments. They've made this image of a golden calf, and they're offering sacrifices to it. And even worse than that, they are giving credit to this golden calf for delivering them from the Egyptians. It's this huge slap in the face to God, and he had every right to call off the engagement. But because he's a good and gracious God, he doesn't do that. Instead, he loves them so much that he gives them a second chance. He tells Moses, go get 2 other stones and come back up here, and we're going to do this thing. And this is Exodus 34, beginning at verse 10. The Lord said to Moses, listen, I'm making a covenant with you in the presence of all your people, and I'm going to perform miracles that have never been performed anywhere in all the earth or in any nation. And all the people around you will see the power of the Lord, the awesome power that I will display for you. But listen carefully to everything I command you today. Then I will go ahead of you and drive out your enemies. Be very careful never to make a treaty with the people who live in the land where you're going. If you do, you will follow their evil ways and be trapped. So instead, you must break down their pagan altars, smash their sacred pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. And it's here where God is going to reveal his name. You, verse 14, you must worship no other gods, for the Lord, whose very name is jealous, is a God who is jealous about his relationship with you. What are we supposed to do with that? So God is jealous. Aren't we told in another passage of the Bible that we should not be jealous? You know the familiar passage, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it's often referred to as the love chapter. It begins with love is patient, love is kind, and then it says, but love is not jealous. God is love. Love is not jealous. God says, I am a jealous God. What? It's all very, very confusing. Trust me, I racked my brain over this thing. In light of the destructive nature of jealousy that I was just talking about, what are we supposed to make of God saying he's jealous? This was a very difficult passage to try to unpack and study. It was difficult personally for me to wrestle with because if you've, so often jealousy and anger, kind of like we saw in that video, they kind of go hand in hand. And if you've been coming to Old Town for any length of time, you know that a common refrain that you're going to hear from me is that God is not angry. And so it would seem that jealousy and God being jealous would fly in the face of that, kind of. But I don't think it does. It's not the same kind of jealousy that you and I experience. I mean, some of it is that, but there is a slight difference. I think that just like there's a righteous anger and just like that there's a godly sorrow or a healthy fear, I believe that there is a healthy and there's a righteous kind of jealousy, especially when you look at God's jealousy through the lens of a healthy marital relationship. And again, I need you to underline healthy there. It's interesting that the same Apostle Paul, who said in 1 Corinthians 13 that love is not jealous, well, he says in another verse in 2 Corinthians that he himself is jealous. He says this is 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. For I am jealous for you, and he's speaking to the Corinthian church in this case. He said, I'm jealous for you with the jealousy of God himself. So he's saying there's whatever is stirring up jealousy in the heart of God, Paul is saying it's the same thing that is stirring up jealousy in his own heart. And so he shares what that motivating factor is in the next statement he makes. He says, okay, so for I am jealous for you with the jealousy of God himself, because I promised you as a pure bride to one husband, Christ. Again, we see this analogy of marriage and the promise of faithfulness and fidelity to the husband, as the reason for his jealousy. So the city of Corinth was one of the most wicked cities in these ancient times. And the church was surrounded by all of these heathen customs and practices, and they were often tempted to give in to idolatry. And sometimes they, in fact, did give in to idolatry. And this created a protective jealousy in the heart of Paul. He says, I fear that somehow your pure and your undivided devotion to Christ is going to be corrupted, just like Eve was deceived by the cunning ways of the serpent. I think we have the best intentions, like the Israelites. I think they really meant it. They said, yeah, we'll do whatever it takes to be faithful to this covenant relationship. That's our desire, to have this pure and undivided devotion to Christ. But unfortunately, we so easily turn to other gods. And that is the issue here. It's idolatry. When you see why it was that God, in the context of that scripture, was describing himself as jealous, it's because of this command that we have no other gods before him. It's let me read it again. Exodus 34:14. You must worship no other gods, for the Lord, whose very name is jealous, is a God who is jealous about his relationship with you. This is a protective jealousy where God sees the idols of our life as a threat that needs to be removed. Kind of like a husband or a wife would be protective over their spouse. It's understandable. When a married man or married woman, they wouldn't want their spouse flirting with somebody else, nor would we even like the idea of somebody else flirting with them or kind of getting up on them. This kind of happened to me. I went to, I don't know when it was, baby, like when we went to New York with Vanessa. It was somebody's birthday, and we went to this club. And listen, I'm so not even with the club scene. Okay, that was 1998, Rudy, that was into that. But anyway, they talked me into going to this club. And what was it? It was a club. It was a club. I have my wife here my version is the right version. I'm the one with the mic, so you're jacked. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Anyway, we were in a club. And you know how girls do? They dance in a little circle and they do that thing and they're just, dancing with themselves. And so I was off to the side and whatever I was doing there. Well, I'm watching Charlene and her sisters, and they're just having innocent fun. They're just dancing, and it's really cute. And anyway, I see all of a sudden Rico Suave and his gang of misfits kind of coming in, and I'm like, oh my goodness. And they start dancing too, and at first they're kind of dancing far off, but then I see the dude's kind of dancing a little bit closer, and there's Charlene, and then he kind of turns, and she can't see him, but I see him. And it looks like he's dancing with her. Man, and my blood just got to boiling, and anger rose up in me. as I was trying, being protective over my bride. And I don't know, I just, in the middle of the whole thing, it's kind of like, we're out of here. And it's made like a scene. Babe, come on out of here. Come out of this, den of sin that we were in. And we left the club, and I tell that story because it's just fun to tell that story. But my jealousy in that moment was protective. I just saw something coming against my wife, and I was just not having it. And it was protective. But with that said, my jealousy was well-meaning, but it was imperfect because it was mingled with insecurity. It was mingled with possessiveness, some pridefulness, some of that, just machismo-ness, whatever. It's not the jealousy of God. Okay, there is a difference. I read this great little devotional by Pastor Ray Stedman, who does a great job describing the difference between healthy jealousy and the jealousy that I demonstrated that day. He said this: false jealousy is always selfish. It's concerned with your own feelings. It is possessive, and it wants to control another person. It is therefore often dominating and even cruel and tyrannical. It usurps the rights of others and insists on its own way. It is imposed upon someone else, whether that person likes it or not. We're leaving this club. I don't care. I know you're having a great time with your sister, and this is the first time we're in New York, but we're out of here. Sorry about that, babe. That was... Anyway, whether they like it or not, it's imposed upon them. Because it's so vicious in its cruelty and its tyranny, jealousy perhaps is the most destructive force in the world today. And that was the jealousy, again, as well-meaning as I was. It was not exactly righteous. But a true jealousy, a godly jealousy, on the other hand, as Paul felt for the Corinthians, is one that arises from a deep passion for the welfare of another. The Paul he's expressing concern for the church because he knows they're being tempted to flirt with these other gods that are going to do harm to them. Again, the issue is idolatry, and he knows that the idols that we so often run to have the potential to be destructive. They have the potential to harm us and rob us of the goodness of God, the one who truly gives life and all things pertaining to life and godliness. And so his jealousy is prompted by a concern for the people that he loves so much. And it's the same thing with God. Anything that stands in the way of us and him is viewed as a threat to our relationship with our Father. And so out of love and out of concern for us, he is jealously protective over us. The dangerous thing is, man, almost anything can become an idol. Listen to what Tim Keller says about idols. This is in a book called Counterfeit God. But listen to what he says. The human heart takes good things like a successful career, like love, material possessions, fishing, hunting, basketball, magic, even family. And he turns them into the ultimate things. And our hearts begin to deify them as the center of our lives because we think they can give us significance and security and safety and fulfillment if we attain them. And we all have got something or someone or something we look to for security. And sometimes those things, they aren't necessarily bad in themselves, but if they're getting in the way of our complete dependence upon God for our significance and for our security and for our safety and for fulfillment, if they're somehow corrupting our pure devotion to Christ, well, we need to get rid of those idols. God is a jealous God, and he doesn't want anything, any person, or any possession to ever take his place in our life. See, God wants what we want in a relationship. He wants our devotion. He wants to be our number one priority. Yesterday, me and my lovely bride celebrated 17 years of marriage. It was awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that my wife needs to know that after God, that she is my number one top priority. I mean, there's times when I had to tell that to my kids. There's Rudy here? Anyway, there's one point where I had to tell my son, we had a bunch of drama, but I said, Rude, I need you to know I love you, but I am firstly committed to mom over you. And that was a difficult thing for me to say and for him to hear. But I mean, this thing, when you turn 18, you're going to dip, right? And mom's with me forever. So, I'm with her on this one. And that was difficult. But I wasn't always like that. When our first year of marriage, I was trying to do some dumb recording project. It wasn't dumb. I mean, it was listening to some of the songs that were on that CD. I mean, it was not excellent. But anyhow, but I spent so much time in the studio late night into 1 a.m, and Charlene wondering, what gives? We just got married, and here I am with these kids, and you're out at the studio recording. Well, how do you think that worked out? It was not good. It created just division and dissension, and it was not a healthy thing for our marriage. Well, thank God by his grace, I just scrapped the whole thing. That and a word from my friend Patty Tassett blew up the whole thing. And I thank God for that. I was making music and the pursuit of fame and fortune. I was making it an idol. And worse, I was trying to do it on the back of the gospel, making a Christian CD. I was doing that because I wanted to bring glory to my name, not the Lord's anyway. I've begun to make Charlene a priority. Just this weekend, there was this awesome magic convention. I know it sounds nerdy, but to me, this thing would have been awesome. Some of my favorite magicians were there. I could do that, or I can take my wife out for our anniversary. Which one? Choose life or death, right? It's like, well, praise God. I chose, of course, my wife, and you know what? It was easy. It wasn't hard. I love magic, but I'm not making that thing an idol. I'm sure it's not going to put that in front of my wife. But it took a long time to get to that point, my friends. Right? So this same principle that makes for a happy marriage it makes for a happy and healthy, growing relationship with the God of the universe. That's why Jesus says this, Matthew 6, verse 33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all those other things will be given to you as well. Again, it's not that those things are bad, but first make God the number priority. When we do that, we're going to find that everything will begin to fall into place and we'll be rewarded by our Father for our faithfulness. And so, very quickly, how do you know whether or not you are making something or someone the ultimate thing? How do you do that? Well, Tim Keller shares 4 ways that we can identify the idols in our life. I'm only going to share 3, and even these 3, I'm just going to go through them briefly. I would encourage you to download the book on your Kindle or whatever. It's Counterfeit Gods, fantastic stuff. Or you can go on a podcast, and there's a series there on idolatry. It's fantastic. So very quickly, I'm going to share 3 of them. The first thing that he says is we need to stop and consider what we spend a lot of our time thinking about. He shares this quote from Archbishop William Temple, who said that your religion is what you do with your solitude. In other words, sometimes the God of our heart is what it is that we habitually think about when nothing else is demanding our attention. Now, again, he's not talking about just the occasional daydreams. He's talking about the things that occupy our thought life when we have nothing else to think about. What is the thing that you consistently ruminate over, constantly? Consider that, asking God to search your heart, and you might find an idol. Second thing he says is we need to look at how we spend our money. This one is huge. Jesus said, where your treasure is, that's where your heart goes. That's Matthew 6:21. Our money flows towards those things that we value the most. And because of that, money has this incredible, powerful way of exposing the idols of our heart. Where are you spending your discretionary income? Where are you pouring your money into? And looking at that, again, you may find that there's an idol attached to it. And then the last, final test is to look at your own uncontrollable emotions. I think this one's really good. In fact, I shared it about 3 years ago in another message that I did, so it's going to be familiar to some of you who've been with us for the long haul. But this is right out of Tim Keller's book. I'm going to read it to you. He says, just as a fisherman looking for fish knows to go where the water is agitated, he uses a word roiling, which means agitated. Look for your idols at the bottom of painful emotions, especially those that never seem to lift and that drive you to do the things that you know are wrong. So if you're angry, in other words, then ask yourself, is there something here that's too important to me? Something that I'm telling myself I have to have at all costs. And then do the same thing about strong fear or despair and guilt. Ask yourself, am I so scared because something is being threatened which I think is a necessity when it's not? Good question. Am I so down on myself because I've lost or failed at something which I think is a necessity when it's not? If you're overworking, and this is many of us in this room, I can be this. If you are overworking and driving yourself into the ground with frantic, unending activity, well then ask yourself, do I feel that I must have this thing to be fulfilled or to feel significant? And when you ask questions like that, when you pull your emotions up by the roots, as it were, sometimes you will find your idols clinging to them. That is so powerful. As we look at our life, our thought life, as we examine our emotions and we examine our pocketbook, we are bound to, I guarantee, because we're all imperfect and we're a work in progress, we're bound to find something that we're making into an idol. And because God is a jealous God, he's not going to allow us to put other gods before him without taking some action to help us see the error of our ways. And man, sometimes that can be a painful process. The story that I had shared last week with Gideon, I didn't get into this too much, but that book opens up with these words, if you'll remember, that the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. And so what did he do? The Lord then handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years, and I shared that story with you last week. Okay, well, what evil did the Israelites do? What did they do that would cause God to give them over to their enemy? Well, what they did was they engaged in idolatry. Gideon, his dad, in their own backyard, had an altar built up to Baal. In his own backyard. That was in Gideon's daddy's house. Idolatry was the evil that they had done. They ran to idols, and it was because of their idol worship, making other things the ultimate thing, that Yahweh said, have at it, man. Go, I'll give you over to your enemy, and let's see if your God Baal can hook you up like I do. Now, it sounds jacked, and it sounds mean, but God did that out of a righteous anger and a deep love and concern for his people. And you know what? It served its purpose. Because 7 years later, after they had enough pain and punishment under the hand of the Midianites, well, they finally did cry out to Yahweh. And he heard them. But before God was able to set them free from the enemy, before he was able to set them free from bondage and oppression, they needed to be set free of the idols that they had made. And that was God's very first challenge to Gideon. He said, you know what, the first thing I want you to do is go to your daddy's house and you tear down the idols that your pops put in the backyard. Tear them down. And sure, fearful, he did it in the cover of night. But he was willing to do that, whatever it took. And he tore down those idols. He said, put down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. Then build an altar to the Lord your God here on this hilltop sanctuary. It was only after Gideon destroyed those idols that God was able to set them free from the enemy. And he did. Some of us in this room are experiencing really tough times. You're experiencing oppression and fear, adversity of some sort, and a slew of other negative things. Could it be that the reason you're experiencing those things is because God is trying to tell you something? He's trying to get your attention. He's trying to get you to turn your heart back to him. And so maybe he's just allowed you to be given over to those things that we seem to desire so much, in spite of the destructive consequences. Have you given your love and your worship to another God to the degree that it's provoked Yahweh's jealousy? If so, what is that thing? It would be good to run through those questions that Tim Keller presented to us. Asking the God to search our hearts if there be any way in which we are giving ourselves over to an idol. But what are the idols? Are you making your job the main thing to the point where your wife is maybe saying, man, that's your job is your wife, not me. Or husband saying to a wife, that's whatever it is. You're putting another thing before me. That's the same kind of thing here. We're making something else an idol, putting it before God. Could it be some hobby? Maybe it's a substance of some sort or a relationship that you are making the ultimate thing. Because he's a jealous God who wants our full love and our full devotion, he's going to do whatever is necessary to turn our hearts back to him. And so some of us today really need to examine our hearts. And as we do that, and we're confronted with the idols of our heart, what are we going to do? Because we have a choice to make, just like Gideon had a choice. We have a choice. Are we going to acknowledge the fact that we're making something or someone, some possession, the ultimate thing, and then lay that idol aside or destroy it and turn to Jesus, or settle for some false sense of security and essentially walk away from him? It really is a choice, and my prayer for Old Town Church is that we would choose the latter. Turn to the living God and experience freedom from oppression and adversity, again, as we turn to him.